Hi, my name is Jim Brule, and I'm a Magid. I'm a Jewish inspirational storyteller and spiritual guide. And I'm here today to share with you a Jewish story. Now, when people think of Jewish stories, a lot of times they think about folklore, they think about myth, they think about stories from the Bible. But we often don't think about stories from the Talmud. The Talmud is this collection of tremendously detailed rules and laws and ways that we're supposed to understand the difference between this and that and how maybe two opposites can be true at the same time. But we don't normally think of it as a great repository of stories, but it is, in fact. And it turns out that one of my favorite stories comes from the Talmud, comes from Bava Metzia. And it's a story called the Oven of Akhnai. So, in this story, there's a conflict, as there always is, between some of the rabbis. In fact, in this case, the conflict is between one rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, and everyone else. And here's the story. There was a problem with ovens. And ovens at the time were big affairs. They sat on the ground, they were made out of clay, and they were used to cook lots and lots of bread or whatever it was they were being cooked for many people. They were the equivalent of commercial ovens. The problem was that they would be sitting on the ground, and every now and then a rodent might crawl into one of these ovens when they were cool. And of course, the moment that happens, the whole oven is rendered impure. And the only thing you can do with it at that point is to tear it down and build it again. It's a terrible thing that a community would have to go through if God forbid, one of their ovens should be rendered impure in this way. So Rabbi Eliezer had a clever idea. He said, well, since things are only pure or impure if something gets inside of it, what if we made an oven that was made of rings, one ring on top of another, coiled almost like a snake. Akhnai means snake. And between each ring, we made a little bit of room that we filled with gravel or something so that there were actually separate rings that were there. And so there would be no inside or outside, there'd just be rings. And that way, if, God forbid, the oven gets inhabited by a rodent, it won't be made impure. And that was his solution. That was Eliezer's solution. And all the other rabbis said, that's a technicality. The spirit of the law is very clear. You can't have an oven that's been inhabited by a rodent and continue to use it. It'll be impure. And they argued and they argued and they argued. And Talmud tells us that they argued all the arguments in the world. Now, if you've seen arguments in the Talmud, if they say they're doing all the arguments in the world, that's a lot of arguments. They couldn't come to a conclusion. Eliezer wouldn't give up his position, and the rest of the rabbis, every rabbi except Eliezer, wouldn't give up theirs. So finally, Rabbi Eliezer says this. I'll tell you what, if I'm right, and there he was standing in the courtyard of the Beit Midrash. If I'm right, let this carob tree which growing on one side of the courtyard, let it prove it to you. And as soon as he spoke those words, the carob tree lifted itself up out of the ground, flew all the way across the courtyard, and planted itself on the other side. Would seem to be pretty convincing. But the other rabbi said, what does a carob tree know about the law? That doesn't prove anything. Rabbi Eliezer says, I tell you what, if I'm right, let this stream, the stream that ran through the courtyard in the center of the Beit Midrash, let this stream prove it. And as soon as he spoke those words, the stream started flowing backwards. Well, you might imagine what the rabbi said. What does a stream know about Torah? What does a stream know about the law? It doesn't prove anything. Okay, says Eliezer. I'll tell you what. These walls of the Beit Midrash, which have heard all of our arguments, let them decide. And as he spoke, the walls started to crumble in. With that, Rabbi Joshua, who was the head of the other rabbis at that point, said, "You may not interfere with the arguments of rabbis." Out of respect for Rabbi Joshua, they stopped falling in, but out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer, they didn't stand up straight either. So what's Eliezer to do? He says, I'll tell you what. If I'm right, let heaven prove it. And as soon as the words left his mouth, a voice came down from heaven, a bat kol came down from heaven and said, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And not only is he right about this, he's right about everything. Can't get more authoritative than that, or so you would think. Rabbi Joshua turns his head to the skies and he says, this is not your argument anymore. You gave us the Torah. Remember, it's no longer in the heavens. It's in your hearts and in your mouths. It's too late. It's our Torah now. Now, you might imagine that that's the end of the story. But of course it isn't. Now, you know that there's a Babylonian Talmud and there's also a Jerusalem Talmud. There's two Talmuds. And they're almost always exactly the same, except when they're not. And this is one of those times where they're different. The Babylonian Talmud, which is what we normally study, tells the story this way. Many years later, Rabbi Nathan was walking down the road and he encountered Eliyahu. May he come swiftly and in our time. And he said to Eliyahu, he said, what happened in the heavens when Rabbi Joshua rebuked God? And Eliyahu says, God laughed. He laughed and laughed. He said, my sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me. And you know there was a sense of pride in that. That finally these humans that had grown up under his tutelage had taken the law into their own hands and now were wrestling with it as if it were their own. And he was happy and laughing and proud. Not so in the Palestinian Talmud. In that Talmud, the same thing starts to happen. Joshua encounters Eliyahu and asks what happened, and Eliyahu says, God wept. God wept. My sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me. Why? Because what happens next in the story is that the anger between Eliezer and the rest of the rabbis erupts. And Eliezer is excommunicated. And our faith is fractured at that point. The leaders cannot find a way to agree, or to at least get along. And they throw Eliezer out at great peril. So I ask you, when you encounter such divergent views from your own, how do you greet the bearer of those views? Do you hold them close despite their difference, or do you expel them? Do you see their common humanity? Or do you reject them? This is the challenge that the Talmud puts before us. Will God laugh or will God weep? It's up to us.